The device was cold in her hands, heavier than it looked, the way dead weight always is. Maravas stood at the edge of a logging road in the Appalachian dark, the pines pressing close on both sides, and listened to the forest decide whether it was going to kill her tonight. Creek somewhere below whined in the high branches. Somewhere behind her, 2 miles back, a man named Garrett Chu was either unconscious or dead, and the distinction no longer mattered to the mission, only to her. She had been a field analyst for the Threshold Bureau for 11 years. She was 34 years old. She had a sister in Asheville who thought she worked for the EPA, and a photograph of her mother in the lining of her field jacket, and a scar along her left collarbone from a job in Bucharest that she was not authorized to discuss even now. She had also, until 8 months ago, had a partner named Daniel Reyes, who knew how to make terrible coffee and told worse jokes and was currently somewhere in Lower Manhattan doing things she was not certain he had chosen to do. That was the part that wouldn't leave her alone. Not whether he was alive, whether he was still him. She shifted the device under her arm and started walking. The device had come out of a cache beneath a fire lookout tower in the Smokies, third in a series of locations by a source named Yevgenia, who was herself by now probably dead. It was roughly the size of a hardback novel, encased in something that was not quite metal and not quite ceramic, with a surface that seemed to redistribute pressure the moment you gripped it. Never uncomfortable, always slightly wrong. Like shaking and hands with something that had learned the gesture, but not the impulse behind it. Threshold's technical division had named them anchors. The Greys had a different name, untranslatable. What mattered was what they did, which was this. In sufficient concentration, a cluster of anchors could rewrite the spatial coordinates of a bounded volume of spacetime. Move a mountain, move a city block, move a city. 6 had been confirmed. Threshold believed there were 9 total. Mara had one. Garrett had been carrying a second before whatever had happened to him had happened to him. She didn't go back. The morphs. The other side of this particular war, a war that humanity had not started and had not been consulted on, had been running their own retrieval operation for weeks, using humans who had agreed to work for them. The distinction between the morphs' human operatives and the Greys' contaminated ones was one of the first things Threshold had briefed her on when she'd been read into the full picture 18 months ago. The morphs coerced and paid. The Greys reprogrammed. The morphs used people. The Greys replaced them. She thought about Daniel's laugh, the exact quality of it. Whether it was still in there. The logging road came out on a 2-lane highway, and Mara walked along the shoulder for a quarter mile, until she reached a rusted pull-off where a green Forest Service truck was parked with its headlights off. She opened the passenger door without knocking and got in. The man behind the wheel was named Okafor. He was 61 years old, built like a former lineman who had decided that was enough, and he had the particular stillness of a person who has long since stopped being impressed by things that would impress most people. He looked at the device under her arm. "Where's Chu gone?" He started the engine. "1 or 2. 2. I have one." Chu had the second. Okafor pulled out of the pull-off and pointed them north. "So they have 2. At minimum, he was quiet for a while. Outside, the mountains slid past in the dark, indifferent and enormous. "They're moving everything to New York," he said finally. That's confirmed. 2 days, maybe 3, the final shutdown. That's what they're calling it." He paused. "Both sides." That was the part Threshold still hadn't worked out. What it meant that both alien factions used the same phrase for an event they were, ostensibly, in conflict over. Both sides wanted the anchors in New York. Both sides were calling their confrontation by the same name. Either they had agreed on a word for war, which was possible, or it was not the confrontation Threshold thought it was. Mara held the device in her lap and looked at its surface in the glow of passing road signs. "Has anyone considered," she said, "that they might not actually be fighting each other?" Okafor didn't answer. Heat was answer enough. She slept 4 hours in the back seat of a clean car outside Knoxville, while Okafor handled logistics she wasn't cleared for. When she woke, They were on I-81 heading north, and the sky was the particular gray of 5 in the morning that has no warmth in it at all. There was a paper cup of gas station coffee in the cup holder that was, remarkably, still warm. She drank it. It was bad. She felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for about 20 hours. 4. How many of us are still operational? In the field. 6, counting you. Command structure is intact, but... He made a gesture with one hand that covered a lot of ground. Communication is compromised at 2 nodes. We think they have someone inside. Bureau level, not field. So they know we're coming. They know something is coming. They don't know what we know. What do we know? He was quiet for a moment. We know where they're setting up. We know the general shape of the process. How many anchors, how they need to be arranged, what kind of dwell time they need for synchronization. We know we have a window of about 40 minutes once synchronization begins before the coordinates lock. And after they lock, Manhattan goes somewhere else. Best case, it's still in the solar system. Mara looked out the window at the early gray light on the Virginia hills. What's worst case? They fold it somewhere that isn't addressable in 3-dimensional space. He paused. 2.5 million people. She turned the paper cup in her hands. Who else knows about Daniel? Anyone who needs to. That's not an answer. Okafor glanced at her in the rear view. Command knows he was taken and processed. They've issued the standard designation. Which is? Compromised asset. Non-recoverable. She turned back to the window. Non-recoverable. She'd written that designation herself, once, about a man in Vilnius, who had been something other than a man for at least a month before anyone noticed. She had written it in a report, in standard field language, and filed it, and it had been accurate and correct. And had cost her nothing, because she had not known him. She thought about Daniel Reyes standing in the kitchen of their shared safe house in Baltimore, making terrible coffee, and explaining that the trick was to use more grounds and less heat, and the coffee being bad regardless, and her telling him so, and him laughing that laugh. She said nothing else. They drove north. New York, in the hours before dawn, has a sound all its own. Not silence, never that, but a held breath quality. The city in the brief interval between whatever it was doing last night and whatever it is about to do. Steam from a grate. The flat percussion of a delivery truck. Pigeons resettling on a ledge. Mara came in through Queens in a different car, with an address committed to memory, and nothing else. The car went back with a courier who did not make eye contact. She walked the last 8 blocks with the anchor inside a canvas tote bag, and thought about how many people on this block would be here in 3 days. The address was a sub-street-level workshop under a laundry in Astoria. The door was metal, fitted with a lock that looked standard and was not. She went in. There were 4 people inside. She knew 2 of them. A threshold analyst named Besson, thin and precise and perpetually slightly damp, as if he'd just come in from rain that wasn't there. And a woman named Fuentes, who had been DEA before Threshold had recruited her, and who still moved like she was expecting someone to run. The other 2 were new. A young man with close-cropped hair and the flat, careful effect of someone who had recently been through something he wasn't going to discuss, and a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and hands that moved constantly, adjusting, touching, never still, who introduced herself only as Marsh. On the folding table in the center of the room was an anchor. "One more," Besson said, looking at Mara's bag. "We have 2. They have at least 2, possibly more." Fuentes was already working a tablet, tracking 3 convergence points. Lower Manhattan, near the financial district. Separate teams. At least 2 of them are humans they're running. 1 set morph, 1 set gray-touched. They're going to different sites, but they're synchronizing. "They're both setting up," Mara said. "Both sides. They've been fighting over the anchors for months. Why would they both be setting up the same process?" Marsh spoke for the first time. Her voice was low and precise. "Because it's not a fight." Everyone looked at her. "Been watching the signal patterns for the last 4 weeks," she said. "The apparent conflict, the retrieval operations running against each other, the casualties on both sides. It's real, but it's not the point. The Greys need 7 anchors minimum in a specific geometric arrangement. The morphs need 9 for the same arrangement with redundancy. They've been competing over the same devices. Yes, competition is not the same as opposition. She paused. Both of them want Manhattan moved. Why? Fuentes asked. Because of what's under it. Marsh touched the folding table. There's something beneath lower Manhattan. Not deep, maybe 40 meters down, buried in bedrock, that neither faction wants to be where it is when the larger conflict they're managing arrives. We don't have a word for what it is. They do, but it doesn't translate. The best approximation is something like a key. Silence. So the war, Besson said slowly, the one they've been fighting each other over, is a preview. A territorial dispute over resources before the real conflict. Think of it as two powers fighting over a military base before the main war breaks out. They both want the base. They fight over it. But they both agree it has to be moved before the larger engagement arrives. Because if either of their enemies gets it, she stopped, shrugged. We don't know what happens then. Threshold doesn't have the context. The young man with the cropped hair had been very still this whole time. He spoke without looking up. How long do we have before Manhattan gets relocated? Either. Marsh looked at her hands. The synchronization window opens in 41 hours. Once they get enough anchors into position and activation begins. 40 minutes. After that, the coordinates lock. Mara set her canvas bag on the table next to the other anchor. Then we have 41 hours to do something other than let them do it, she said. Plan, such as it was, came together in pieces over the next 18 hours. The way plans do when the people making them are tired and frightened and working with incomplete information and have no margin for the comfortable fictions of strategy. They knew 9 anchors total. Threshold now had 2. The grays and morphs between them had at least 4 confirmed, possibly 5. The remaining 2 or 3 were unaccounted for. Activation required a minimum of 7 in a geometric configuration covering roughly the footprint of lower Manhattan, with the coordinates preset to a destination address. What Marsh had worked out, quietly, in the long hours while Mara slept again and woke again. The anchor coordinates were not locked at the point of manufacture. They were set during synchronization. 40-minute window, once opened, in which all 9 devices were in a state of flux, querying, calibrating, resolving their agreed address. If something disrupted that consensus during the window, if even one anchor in the network fed a different set of coordinates to the rest, the network would resolve to the new input. It would still move something. It would not move Manhattan. Sat with this for a long time. Besson made coffee that was improbably worse than Daniel's. She drank it anyway. We need to be inside the synchronization window, she said, with at least one anchor physically in the network, and we need to have the destination coordinates ready before we go in. Destination coordinates for what? Fuentes asked. Mara thought about the thing Marsh had described as a key. About 2 alien civilizations that had, apparently, decided the fate of the human city without consulting a single human. About Daniel Reyes standing in a kitchen in Baltimore that already felt like it belonged to a different life. Not Manhattan, she said. The young man's name turned out to be Solis, and he had grown up in the Bronx, and he had a gift for moving through New York that the rest of them did not. He knew the underground. Not the subway, though he knew that too, but the older layers, the service passages, and the utility corridors, and the sealed-off sections of early 20th century infrastructure that the city had built over rather than removed. He moved through it without hesitation, the way you move through a house you grew up in. He was also, Fuentes told Mara quietly, 18 months out of a threshold detention facility where he'd spent 4 years after being arrested for hacking the Bureau's own systems at 22. Why did he hack us? Mara asked. Looking for his mother, Fuentes said. She was a contaminated asset. He didn't know what that meant when he started. He figured it out while he was inside. Mara thought about that for a while. Does he know she's non-recoverable? He knows what he knows. He works with it. Fuentes paused. He's got good hands. Careful. Solis guided them through 2 miles of service infrastructure in the dark with a headlamp and a mental map, and no hesitation. emerging in a utility room beneath a building in the financial district that was, as most records were concerned, vacant. Shh. It was not vacant. The basement level had been modified. Ceiling-mounted instruments of unknown purpose. A floor plate that had been cut and re-welded at odd angles. And the faint, persistent sound of a frequency too low to name felt more than heard. 3 anchors were already in position, arranged on the modified floor plate in a triangular array, held in place by nothing visible, hovering approximately 2 centimeters above the surface. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at them and thought, "They're not the enemy. They're just tools. The same tools as the ones in her canvas bag. Same weight, same cold surface, same wrongness. How long until they activate the rest of the network?" Solis asked. Marsh checked her watch. 17 hours. Maybe less. They may have moved up the window. Then we get into position, and we wait. Fuentes looked at the hovering anchors and the modified floor and the low-frequency hum that was living in the bones of Mara's jaw. Get into position where? We can't stay here. The moment either faction sweeps this building, we don't stay here. Mara unslung the canvas bag from her shoulder and looked at the anchor inside it. We come back when the window opens, when the network is live and accepting input. She looked at Marsh. You can preload coordinates into this device? Before we go in theory. What coordinates? Mara thought about what Marsh had said. Something under the bedrock. Something neither faction wanted left in place. Something both of them needed relocated before the larger war arrived. The Greys need it moved to keep it from the Morphs, she said. The Morphs need it moved to keep it from the Greys, and neither of them is moving it to somewhere we can follow. She looked around the room. So we move it to somewhere we can. Where? Besson asked. High orbit, Marsh said quietly, and looked at Mara, and something passed between them. You want to move the key to high orbit. I want to move it to somewhere we control. Somewhere we can study it. Somewhere we have some say in what happens to it. Mara set the canvas bag on the floor. They've been running this operation for months. Using our infrastructure, our city, our people, deciding things without us. Moving pieces around a board we're not even supposed to see. She paused. 2.5 million people live up there. Daniel Reyes is up there. Somewhere, doing God knows what in a body that might not be entirely his anymore. And nobody asked. Nobody asked any of us. The frequency in the floor hummed on. I'm tired of being a piece, she said. I want to be a player. The 17 hours were the longest of her life, and also had a strange stillness to them. They rested in shifts. Solis ate something that came from a corner bodega, and did not ask anyone else if they wanted any, which Mara found she respected. Besson wrote and rewrote coordinate calculations on a tablet until Marsh told him he was correct and to stop. Fuentes cleaned her weapon twice, and then a third time, and then put it away and didn't touch it again. Mara found a corner and sat in it and thought about nothing useful. She thought about how her mother used to hum while she cooked. A specific song, an old song, something from before Mara was born, and Mara had never learned the name of it. She thought about Bucharest and the scar on her collarbone, and the young man she had been when she was 25, and had believed that most things had a clean solution if you found the right angle. She thought about Daniel Reyes, who was not non-recoverable. Not to her, not yet, whatever the designation said. Hook. She took the photograph of her mother out of the lining of her jacket and looked at it in the dark. Mother was standing in a garden, squinting against the sun, holding a trowel slightly blurry, because Mara had taken the photograph at 11 years old and had not yet learned to hold still. She was smiling, not at anything in particular. At the garden maybe, at the light. Mara put the photograph back. The synchronization window opened at 3:47 in the morning. They felt it before Marsh's instruments confirmed it, a shift in the quality of the hum, deepening and widening, spreading through the walls and floors of the building above them, like something very large drawing breath. The 3 anchors on the floor plate flickered from the barely visible glow they'd been maintaining for hours to something brighter and more directed. Pulses running between them in a pattern that almost made sense. Network is live, Marsh said. Her voice was flat, Accepting input 40 minutes. Solus was already moving. Took one of Threshold's 2 anchors from the canvas bag and carried it into the room with the care of a man. Transport something that could end him, which it could. He placed it in the array, in the gap that the original configuration had left. As if they'd always known a 4th would be added, as if the geometry demanded it. Pulses changed. Acknowledged. Incorporated. Marsh had the coordinates loaded. She spoke them quietly to the device, in the acoustic linguistic code that was technically a human adaptation of a gray frequency pattern, which was itself a technical specification that Mara was not going to think too hard about right now. "Is it receiving?" Mara asked. "It's receiving." Marsh was very still. "It's fighting. The rest of the network has its target. This one is giving it a different address." "How long until the network resolves?" 6 minutes, maybe 7. The majority waiting is still for the original coordinates. "Our anchor needs to maintain signal dominance." Something changed. Mara felt it as a pressure behind her eyes, a sudden wrongness in the room's geometry, and then Solstice said one word very calmly, and the word was gray, and she turned. 2 of them, in the corridor behind, and a 3rd appearing at the far end of the room, through what was not a door, through a fold, a seam in the air, the kind of entrance you got when the thing doing the entering had not used the infrastructure because it didn't need to. They were tall. The photograph's Threshold had used in briefings had not communicated the height correctly, or the quality of the stillness, or the way looking at them made some pre-verbal part of the brain insist that this is wrong. This is not a thing that belongs here, without being able to specify exactly why. Not horror, not revulsion. Something older and more fundamental. The sensation of standing in the wrong ecosystem. One of them spoke, and the sound was not language, not exactly, but Marsh's translation system caught enough of it. "Step up from the array." No one moved. "You are disrupting a synchronization that was authorized under." "Organized by who?" Mara asked. The sound that came back might have been confusion or recalibration. These were not things the Greys had demonstrated over the course of this war. They had been expecting to need to manage. "This planet is not without governance," she continued. "You have been operating in our cities, in our people without. This Thothla planet's governance does not extend to." "Watch me," Mara said. She said it the way you say something when you have already decided, and everything after is just time passing until the decision is visible to other people. The Grey closest to her took 2 steps forward. The movement too smooth, too coordinated. The way everything they did was slightly wrong in its efficiency. Solus hit it from the side with his full body weight. He was not particularly large. He hit it anyway, because that was who he was, and the Grey staggered, and its partner turned to respond. And Fuentes put herself between the array and the second one, with her weapon up, and said nothing at all. 2 minutes. The 3rd Grey, the one that had come through the fold, moved toward Marsh. Besson was already in front of it. Small, damp, precise Besson, who had not fired a weapon in 11 years of field analysis, was standing in front of a Grey, twice his height, with nothing in his hands, and he was not moving. "Sit down," said the Grey, or something that meant that. 1 minute 40, Marsh said from behind him. "It's holding." Besson didn't move. Mara was watching the array. The pulses were running faster now, the competing signals creating interference patterns she didn't understand but could see. Anchor. Threshold's anchor, the one Marsh had preloaded, was putting out a signal that the rest of the network was having to work to reject. Beauty of it was that rejection took time. And time was right now the only resource that mattered. 1 minute. The Grainer Fuentes made a sound, and Fuentes fired. Once, twice, the sound enormous in the low silenced room, and the Grey went down in a way that was not quite like a human going down, but was recognizable as the same fundamental event. 10 seconds. Solus had the first Grey's arm pinned at an angle that was not comfortable for any known anatomy. He looked up at Mara, with blood on his lip, and something in his face that was not fear was almost its opposite, and she thought, there it is. That's the look. That's the one they never planned for. The look that says, "I'm not stopping." 20 seconds. The 3rd Grey stepped around Besson. Marsh had the translation system in one hand, And in the other hand, she had nothing, because she was a data analyst, and had never pretended to be anything else. She stood in front of the array the same way Besson had stood, in front of the gray, and said, very quietly, "No." 10. The resolution came like something snapping. A physical click felt rather than heard, like a joint realigning, like pressure equalizing across a membrane. The anchor array went bright, all 4 units simultaneously, and the hum that had been in the floor for hours swelled into something felt in the chest, and then was gone. Not loud. The opposite of loud, absolute silence for approximately 4 seconds. Then the ambient sounds of the city came flooding back. The distant percussion of early traffic. A siren, far away. Pigeons. The floor plate was empty. The anchors were gone. All 4 of them, relocated with whatever they had decided to relocate. The faint marks where they'd been hovering were already fading. Marsh looked at her instruments for a long time. High orbit? Fuentes asked. Geocentric orbit at 4,200 kilometers, tracking stable. She paused. The key is with the anchors. Whatever it is. The gray near Besson made a sound that the translation system rendered as something between a question and a categorical impossibility. You interfered with the synchronization. Yes, Mara said. The authorization. There is no authorization that covers this planet without our input, Mara said. I want that understood. I want that in whatever record you keep, whatever communication you send back to wherever you come from. Humanity was not consulted about this operation. Humanity was not asked. That ends here, she paused. We know what you were moving. We know where we've moved it. We know you need it. We will be discussing what we know with our own people, and with your people, and with the morphs, and with whoever else has a claim, and we will do that as a party to the negotiation, not as terrain. She looked at the gray, and it looked back at her with those vast still eyes that gave away nothing. Tell them. She did not know if they would. She did not know what the broader implications were. She did not know what Wu looked like at a scale that involved species rather than nations, or whether the object in high orbit would change the calculus of a war she couldn't fully see. She knew she was tired. She knew Solus was bleeding from his lip and had released the gray's arm and was breathing hard but standing. She knew Besson was still standing in front of a gray twice his height and showing no intention of moving. She knew that Fuentes was reloading and that Marsh's instruments were showing 4 stable signals from orbit, and that the floor plate was as empty, and that the city was going to go on existing, which was the most important thing. She thought about Daniel. Non-recoverable. 2.5 million people who would never know how close it had been. She thought, that's not good enough. We'll have to fix it. We'll have to get better at this. But first, alive. All of them still alive. The city still here. The gray that had been on the floor was attempting to stand. It managed it slowly, with an odd dignity. Shh. The one by Besson had not moved, was still looking at Mara with that expression that was not quite readable. Shh. Then it turned, stepped back through the fold it had used to enter, which had partially collapsed during the last 10 minutes, and reopened at some cost, apparently, because the motion was less smooth than before. First gray followed. The third had already left through the corridor. They left without another word, whether that meant they accepted the terms, or whether they were going to recalibrate and come back with something worse. Mara genuinely did not know. They left, and the city was still there, and the 4 of them were still standing in a basement that smelled of concrete and metal, and the particular electrical smell of technology she didn't fully understand. Solus sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and put his forearms on his knees and breathed. Fuentes holstered her weapon. This is going to be a fun debrief. Besson looked down at his hands. I don't want to do that again, he said, with a precision that somehow described several years of accumulated things he hadn't wanted to do. Marsh was still watching her instruments. The signals from orbit were steady. She had a slight smile that Mara's hadn't seen on her face before. The expression of someone whose calculation has been verified by experiment. Mara leaned against the wall. Her knees were asking questions she was going to decline to answer for at least another hour. of her mother was against her sternum through the jacket lining, warm from her own warmth. She thought about Manhattan. 2.5 million people. In apartments, in beds, in all-night bodegas, in hospital waiting rooms, in cabs, in the subway running its usual bad faith schedule under all of it. A city in the middle of a night they would remember only as an ordinary night. She thought about what it would take to tell them the truth. Whether there was a way to do it that would produce anything other than terror. Whether terror was fair, actually, given what they'd nearly lost without knowing it. Whether humans deserved to know what was circling their planet, and what they were worth to it, and how close they were, always, to being a piece moved on a board they couldn't see. She thought, yes, we deserve to know, we need to know. The not knowing is the thing that's been killing us. She would argue that another day. They came out of the building at 6 in the morning, into a city in the act of becoming itself. The way New York always is. Perpetually in the process of turning into the next version of itself. Never finished, never settled, aggressively present. Mara stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just that. Stood there. The air smelled like diesel, and a bakery half a block away, and the particular morning-specific version of the river, which was not clean and did not pretend to be. Solus was already walking. He had a tissue pressed to his lip, and his hands in his jacket pockets, and he moved through the financial district at 6 in the morning, like he owned it, which was its own kind of correct. Fuentes fell into step beside Mara. What happens with the object in orbit? I don't know. Don't know what it is. But it's ours now. It's ours now, Mara said. That's the beginning, not the end. They walked. Later, there would be debriefs. There would be the political architecture of what she'd done, and what it meant, and whether any of it would hold. There would be the question of Daniel, which was not resolved, and would not be for a long time, and which she was not going to let stay unresolved. There would be the grays and the morphs, and whatever they were proxies for, the larger war rolling toward a planet that was, from certain angles, just a piece of strategic real estate, in a conflict it hadn't chosen. But Manhattan was there. The skyline was doing what it always did, existing aggressively, as if it had decided once and for all that it was going to be there. And that was simply how it was. The light coming in from the east turned the glass towers, various shades of copper and rose. Mara looked at it for a moment. The city, not by birth, but by the version of choice that gets made when you've stood between something and the thing that would take it. She hummed something, quietly to herself. A song from before she was born, names still unknown, melody her mother's, vibrating in her chest like a frequency you feel more than hear. Bum. Then she put her hands in her pockets and walked north, into the light, into the morning, into the beginning of the part where humanity got to choose what happened next.